Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Dan Brooks, founder of 3GNY and a grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. For those who don't know, 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. For tonight's event, 3GNY is joined by 8 other 3G chapters across the nation, from New Jersey, Philadelphia, Boston, Miami, Arizona, Baltimore, and San Francisco. We all felt strongly that tonight's event, the current state of anti-Semitism, is a topic that needs to be discussed. With today's social media, the spread of disinformation and outright defamation of the Jewish people presents a major challenge to our community. It's incumbent on us all to educate ourselves about these changes and learn best approaches to combat the world's oldest hatred. I'd like now to introduce Josh Lipowsky, a senior research analyst with the Counter Extremism Project and a fellow 3G. Josh will be our guide tonight on this topic as he unpacks the new anti-Semitism and the modern incarnations of the world's oldest hatred. He holds degrees in global affairs, journalism, Jewish studies, and Hebrew. He has previously worked as an award-winning journalist for multiple Jewish media outlets, covering anti-Semitism and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Josh, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, although the topic is not a great one. But just to start off, giving you a little bit of my background, I am the grandson of 2 Holocaust survivors. My maternal grandfather and grandmother respectively survived Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. My mother was born in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp following the war, and they were then resettled in New Jersey. Just a quick anecdote I would like to share about my grandparents' story. When I was in 8th grade, I was assigned to do a hero project, and I learned a story about my grandfather while he was in Bergen-Belsen that my family only learned at his funeral. He worked in the kitchens at Bergen-Belsen, and to his putting himself in danger and as well as others, he would sneak out scraps of food from the kitchens and bring it back to the barracks. And he did this because knowing the danger, but because he felt it was the right thing to do. And we learned of this story not from my grandfather, but from one of the survivors who was saved because of this. So on that note, I will share my screen and we will get started. This month marks the 3rd anniversary of John Ernest's horrific attack on the Chabad house in Poway, California. On the last day of Passover, killing 1 and wounding 3 others. Ernest claimed inspiration from Brenton Tarrant, who had killed 51 people. Pardon me, 1 second. There we go. Who killed 51 people and wounded 3 others. Ernest claimed inspiration from Brenton Tarrant, who had killed 51 people during twin mosque shootings in New Zealand the month before. Tarrant subscribed to a white nationalist philosophy called the Great Replacement, which postulates that non-European migrants threaten to replace the dominant white European culture. In Tarrant's manifesto, also entitled The Great Replacement, he wrote about the, quote, crisis of mass immigration and how it would, quote, ultimately result in the complete racial and cultural replacement of the European people. Tarrant, Ernest, and other white nationalist groups have attempted to define a broader white European ethnic identity prevalent in the Western world that transcends national borders. They believe that identity is threatened by non-European invaders who want to uproot the dominant culture and implant their own. While Tarrant focused his hatred on Muslims, others like John Ernest and Robert Bowers in Pittsburgh have included Jews as part of the perceived foreign threat. Since the 2018 attack on Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue, observers have noted an increasing number of anti-Semitic attacks and the emergence of what many are calling a new wave of anti-Semitism. Incidents like Poway and Pittsburgh are blatantly anti-Semitic and easy to condemn, but anti-Semitism is not always so recognizable. In New York City, the NYPD recorded a 50% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in 2021 over the same period in 2020. These attacks included assaults on individuals and vandalism of Jewish institutions. Last May, as Israel and Hamas fought an 11-day war, Jews thousands of miles away from the Middle East found themselves under attack because of their religious affiliation. Between May 9th and May 24th last year, Britain's Jewish community recorded 116 anti-Semitic incidents, compared to only 11 during the same period in 2020. In the United States, the Anti-Defamation League received almost 200 reports of anti-Semitic attacks after the conflict began. The group also noted more than 17,000 Twitter posts with variations of "Hitler was right." On May 18th in Los Angeles, a group of men waving Palestinian flags attacked Jewish diners at a sushi restaurant. According to witnesses, the attackers chanted "Death to Jews" and "Free Palestine." A 2020 American Jewish Committee survey found a majority of American Jews felt anti-Semitism was a problem, while 82% felt there had been an increase in anti-Semitism in the United States over the past 5 years. So the question now is, what is driving this surge of modern anti-Semitism? First, let's settle on a definition of anti-Semitism. In 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopted a working definition of anti-Semitism, which has since been adopted or endorsed by more than 30 nations and organizations, including the United States. According to that definition, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. The IHRA listed 11 examples of how anti-Semitism manifests, including calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews, accusing Jews as a people of responsibility for the real or imagined crimes of an individual, accusing Jews of being more loyal to Israel than the nation in which they live, and denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination. So how is this all manifesting? The next step to understanding modern anti-Semitism is to look at its history. While the argument can be made anti-Semitism can be traced as far back as the Egyptian captivity, for our purposes, let's limit our focus to just the past 2,000 years. And so many major events of the past 2 millennia, particularly in Europe and the Middle East, have been driven by religion. Christianity and Islam acknowledge their historical roots in Judaism and base their own validity on the idea that Jews have either rejected God or have been rejected by God, allowing room for the creation of new covenants presented by those religions. Early Christianity pointed to the Jewish rejection of Jesus as the basis for a new covenant with God that superseded the Jewish covenant in the Torah. As Christianity became the dominant religion of Europe and the church became the dominant political power, this rejectionist lens led to the proliferation of laws limiting Jews socially, professionally, and politically. The average early European peasant's knowledge of Jews and Jewish practices stemmed largely from church doctrines that emphasized that the Jewish rejection of the Christian Messiah, thus justifying the Christian rejection of Jews. Further, because of the communal nature of Jewish religious practice, Jews tended to live within close proximity of each other, which led to the development of Jewish quarters in medieval towns. Some of these Jewish quarters later became ghettos after official decrees ordered that Jews should be physically separated. Jews remained behind walls for 400 years in Europe, further contributing to suspicions as to why it was necessary to separate them from society, as well as what took place behind the walls of the ghetto. This separation created a natural aversion among Christians to Jews living in their midst, and therefore, few made the effort to look beyond what they had been taught. They instead theorized based on their limited knowledge and suspicions. The misunderstood nature of Jewish practices also helped feed into myths surrounding them. Observers would see Jews hanging a mezuzah on their doors and recall something from the Bible about Jews in Egypt painting their door frames with blood. The natural conclusion was that Jews were again using blood for some sort of ritual purpose, which fed into accusations of the blood libel, that Jews were taking Christian children for use in sacrifices and other religious rituals. Like Christianity, Islam has promoted the notion of Jewish rejection. According to the Quran, God rejected the Jews based on their rejection of biblical laws. But Jews were people of the book, and God had given them opportunities to repent if they desired. While Jews living under Muslim rule tended to enjoy more freedoms than in Christian Europe, Jews were still largely relegated to second-class status at best. These religious roots of anti-Semitism informed centuries of restrictions and conspiracies, culminating in mass events like the Spanish Inquisition and the Holocaust, while feeding everyday bigotry that led to the rise of the blood libel, government-decreed tribunals against the Talmud, and mob violence. By the dawn of the 21st century, Jewish political fortunes had wholly shifted. Jews enjoyed unprecedented political and economic freedoms and had reestablished their biblical homeland in Israel. This ascension began slowly with Napoleon's emancipation of French Jews in the early 18th century, but it wouldn't be until the horrors of the Holocaust that Jews would attain true emancipation. The large Jewish migrations to America of the 19th and 20th centuries came at the same time that other nationalities and ethnic groups were migrating to the United States. Like other minorities, Jews were subjected to widespread discrimination, but eventually discrimination gave way to success, and that success spread jealousy and contempt among those left behind. So let's take a look at who hates us now. Populated by neo-Nazis and white supremacists, the far right is a familiar antagonist and remains a primary source of anti-Semitic violence. Groups such as the National Socialist Movement and League of the South promote blatantly anti-Semitic propaganda and imagery, while others, such as Robert Bowers, couch their bigotry in language that reframes their enemies as threats to society and themselves as heroes fighting to preserve their culture. As previously mentioned, a common theme among the far right is the Great Replacement theory, the notion that non-European immigrants seek to replace the dominant white European culture with their own. Proponents of this theory proclaim this replacement threatens a genocide against the white race. One such group that subscribes to this is the Patriot Front, a relatively new white nationalist group with a nationwide presence. The Patriot Front is an outgrowth of Vanguard America, one of the groups behind the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. It embraces imagery that is both patriotic and fascist, while employing nationalist messages such as America First and Better Dead Than Red to paint itself as the savior of an America that is losing its culture to foreign invaders. The front is dedicated to creating a nation within a nation that it claims will be a, quote, hard reset of the current America, which it believes is subjugated by an international Zionist agenda and money. While the Patriot Front is an admittedly non-violent group that stages banner drops, rallies, and protests to distribute their propaganda, these kinds of actions only go so far. The replacement theory has also attracted those who feel they need to take more physical action to end what they consider the genocide of the white race, such as Robert Bowers. After the Holocaust, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, helped many of our families resettle in the United States, including my 3-year-old mother and her parents, who were brought out of Bergen-Belsen and resettled in New Jersey. Today, HIAS continues its mission helping refugees around the world. Viewing the organization through the lens of the Great Replacement theory, however, Bowers accused of bringing foreign invaders into the United States. He viewed his horrific actions against the Jewish community as part of a crusade against those supporting this supposed invasion. Even as the far right has traded the hoods and brown shirts of the 20th century for polo shirts and khakis, the rhetoric of the far right is overt and its anti-Semitic undertones are easily identifiable. The far left, on the other hand, has embraced a more discrete form of anti-Semitism by blurring the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Traditionally, the Jewish community has been drawn to left-wing ideology and causes because of the idea of tikkun olam, the concept of repairing the world. Nonetheless, the left has mainstreamed strands of anti-Semitism through its embrace of social justice causes. Israel and its supporters have become a favored target among the far left, which holds that Zionists and Israel, the Jewish nation state, symbolize colonialism and oppression. On college campuses, Jewish students find themselves targeted by those seeking to punish all Jews for the actions of the Jewish state. In April 2019, for example, members of the Emory University chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine posted fake eviction notices on the doors of Jewish students in Emory's residence halls and off-campus housing in protest against Israeli demolitions of Palestinian homes. The sole qualification for receiving a notice was to be identifiably Jewish. Campus leftists have vociferously rejected any relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Indeed, a popular mantra on the left is that it rejects Zionism and the state of Israel, not Jews as a whole. But the reality is that otherwise left-leaning Jews are forced to separate their Jewish identities from their liberal values and choose between the false dichotomy of being liberal or being Zionist. For example, this past October, a proposed voting rights rally was enveloped in controversy after one of the participating organizations issued statements condemning the participation of pro-Israel Jewish organizations. The Freedom to Vote rally was organized by the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition. Sunrise DC, a branch of youth-led climate organization Sunrise Movement, issued a statement declining a speaking spot at the rally because of the participation of the National Council of Jewish Women, the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center, and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Sunrise DC called for their ejection from the rally as they are, quote, are all in alignment with and in support of Zionism and the state of Israel, and quote, Zionism is incompatible with statehood and political sovereignty. Following a national outcry, Sunrise DC issued an apology and said it understood why its initial statement had been seen as anti-Semitic. However, the group also emphasized its continuing commitment to, quote, stand against Zionism, anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinian racism, and all other forms of oppression. Other left-wing groups have sought to explicitly prevent the display of the Star of David and other Jewish symbols that are shared by the state of Israel, thereby excluding displays of Jewish pride by linking all such symbols as representative of the state. These groups collectively hold all Jews responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. There is an assumption of responsibility for Israel's actions by virtue only of a shared religion. Thus, while the far right lumps together all Jews in its vitriol, leftist groups like Sunrise DC have created a with us or against us formula that essentially categorizes Jews as good Jews or bad Jews based on their support of Israel solely because of a shared heritage. So, how does this all come together? What we are seeing from both the far left and the far right is an attempt to normalize anti-Semitism. On the far right, anti-Semitism has been reframed as a jingoist defense against foreign invasion. On the far left, anti-Semitism has been reframed as a litmus test for devotion to social justice. We still see the expression of pure Jew hatred in physical and verbal attacks, as well as vandalism and other acts of intimidation. But there is also this attempt on the left and the right to make anti-Semitism more palatable by portraying it not as an irrational hatred of Jews, which it is, but as the protection of nationalist or socialist values, or social values, I'm sorry, not socialist. At the core, though, today's anti-Semitism is very much the same anti-Semitism we have witnessed for thousands of years, but repackaged to fit modern narratives. Historical anti-Semitism has been both a response to the presence of Jews and a manifestation of the fear of Jews. At the core, what we see is a fear of perceived Jewish power and strength. The Jew is the enemy that needs to be defended against. The Jew is controlling and influencing the system. The Jew is responsible for the ills of the world. Despite a lack of power, Jews have historically been blamed for events that would require a great deal of power. Historical Christian anti-Semitism is rooted in the belief Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, assigning Jews not only the power to sway the Roman government, but to also commit deicide. In medieval Europe, Jews were accused of poisoning water wells to cause the plague. And again today, we've seen the far right lash out at Jews for either creating, spreading, or holding back a cure for the coronavirus. Hitler and the Nazis blamed the Jews for Germany's economic and social woes, creating a convenient scapegoat to distract the German people and a target for their anger. Hitler didn't innovate the perception of the devious Jewish power brokers, but he successfully incorporated it into a national narrative. And despite decades of research into the Holocaust, including photographic and anecdotal evidence, that narrative survives. A 2020 survey by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany found 11% of Americans under 40 believed the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. 15% said they thought the Holocaust was a myth or had been exaggerated. And in New York State, 20% of adults under the age of 40 felt that Jews had caused the Holocaust. The implication of all these accusations is Jews have the power to shape national and global events. Even the charge of dual loyalties, which long predates the establishment of the modern state of Israel, assumes the presence of a larger, powerful Jewish entity that commands ultimate fealty, such as the shadowy, learned elders of Zion. The irony is Jews have historically been powerless throughout much of modern history. They've been restricted professionally, forced to wear identifying clothing, forced to live in specific areas, and generally made subservient to the whims of the ruling class. As Jews began to gain a modicum of freedom, the historical scapegoat became an even larger target. In fact, some of the biggest anti-Semitic myths were born out of the historical repression of Jews. The Jewish association with finance stems from the medieval professional restrictions on Jews that limited them to money lending because the Catholic Church believed collecting interest was sinful. The myth that Jews control Hollywood and the entertainment industry arose in the early 20th century when Jews joined the burgeoning American film industry because they were often shut out of other careers. Such accusations are no longer exclusive to far-right conspiracy theorists who see Jews as shadowy puppeteers, or radical Islamists justifying terrorism, or leftists who vilify Israel as a Nazi state. Historically, it was easy to assign blame to a powerless and nomadic group. Charging Jews with responsibility for society's ills alleviated responsibility from those with actual power. And more importantly, it distracted the general population from holding those in power responsible. The emergence of a physical Jewish nation state in 1948 provided anti-Semites with a centralized representation of Jewish power on the world stage, replacing the Illuminati-esque elders of Zion with a very public manifestation of Jewish power. As Jews gained political and economic success in the 20th century, old anti-Semitic attitudes mixed with modern politics to cast suspicions on successful Jews who must obviously be in service of a larger cause, whether Israel or another vast Jewish conspiracy. And these attitudes continue today. For example, some of you may have seen memes circulating the internet labeling the heads of global medical and pharmaceutical organizations as part of a vast Jewish conspiracy. Such attitudes are not confined to the dark corners of the internet either, as shown by a 2018 CNN poll that found 1/3 of Europeans think Jews are too politically powerful. Further, these conspiracies of Jewish power have seeped into the political mainstream on both sides of the aisle. When US Representative Ilhan Omar accused AIPAC of unduly influencing US foreign policy, she was accusing Jews of having too much power. when then presidential candidate Donald Trump told a group of Jewish Republicans they wouldn't like him because they couldn't control him with their money, it was based on a belief, though benign, of Jewish power. In an increasingly polarized world, it has become common to hear those on the right and the left accuse one another of presenting the greater danger while downplaying rhetoric and actions from their own side. But both sides of the political spectrum have employed anti-Semitic imagery and rhetoric based on the pervasiveness of old stereotypes and a continuing belief that, for whatever reason, Jews hold the keys to the halls of power. This underlying theme is at the core of all forms of anti-Semitism, whether it is overt or unintentional. And just as an aside, not all anti-Semitism is intentional. Sometimes it may truly be a stray comment about Jewish bargain hunting or a misplaced remark about Jewish business acumen based on ignorance. Nonetheless, whether the intent is malicious or not, the origin is in an age-old belief in Jewish power. The result of this type of rhetoric is people like Pittsburgh shooter Robert Bowers and others like him taking it upon themselves to strike back against these perceived enemies to reclaim that power, or hate crimes against Jews under the guise of social justice, as at Emory University, or suicide bombings and car rammings against Israelis. We've also seen these kinds of ideas manifest outside the Jewish community in recent years. In 2017, white nationalists marched through the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, chanting, "You will not replace us." In March 2019, Brand Tarrant attacked 2 mosques in New Zealand. And much like Jews were blamed for poisoning the wells of medieval Europe to cause the Black Plague, followers of QAnon conspiracies pinned the blame for the coronavirus pandemic on Bill Gates, 5G cell towers, and even vaccines. Various QAnon theories blame Gates for creating the virus, seeking to profit from a coronavirus cure, or potentially using a vaccine to implant controlling microtechnology into people. While QAnon theories may not specifically target Jews, they mirror the pernicious tropes of secretive, manipulative cabals seeking global domination that anti-Semites have used against Jews for millennia. Combating anti-Semitism means recognizing it in all of its forms and vociferously condemning it. It is incumbent upon all of us to educate ourselves to recognize anti-Semitism in its many disguises and speak out forcefully. For as Hillel said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Because for those who feel insecure in their current place in the modern world, and especially for those who wish to manipulate unease in order to gain power for themselves, the Jew continues to be a convenient target. As mentioned earlier, I am the grandson of survivors, and I just want to dedicate this presentation to the memory of my mother, Trudy, who passed away last year. She was a fierce believer in the power of education. I also am dedicating this to the memories of my grandparents and all victims of baseless hatred. Now, 2,000 years is a lot of content to squeeze into 25 minutes. So for a more in-depth look at the history of anti-Semitism and the themes I discussed tonight, please see the Counter Extremism Project's anti-Semitism resources on our website, and I'll drop all this information into the chat as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Daniel.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that very thorough breakdown. For considering it was only 25 minutes, it's a lot of good information. I will be joined now by 3GNY President David Wax and going through the questions in the Q&A. And I do have the first question that does speak to what you just talked about your family. And I'd like, if it's possible, to talk a little bit about your connection with your grandparents. And the question is, has your being a 3G influenced your career? And if so, how exactly?
I would certainly say so. Growing up, I heard many stories of my grandparents' experiences in the Holocaust. And it was always, a big part of my childhood, as well as my parents' focus on education. And that certainly led me to my first career in journalism, and specifically in Jewish journalism, as I sought to be a purveyor of truth and knowledge. While working within Jewish journalism, I discovered an affinity for international stories, which led me eventually to obtaining a master's degree in global affairs, and which led me to my current position.
All right, thank you. I'm going to now alternate with David Wax and ask the next question, and we'll take turns looking at the Q&A box. So again, as Dave just texted in the chat box, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as we see them.
Yes, please ask away anything. We'd love to try and answer any questions you have. Before we dig in onto some deeper ones, I will ask a lighter one. What is the definition, of the difference between left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism?
So, left-wing anti-Semitism and right-wing both approach from different lenses. The left-wing anti-Semitism tends to approach view through a lens of focus through social justice and Israel, in specific. So the focus is not so much on Jews, but on but on fighting perceived oppression. And Israel is held up as an example of modern oppressors in many far left circles. The right wing and the far right tend to focus approach anti-Semitism through a lens that is focused primarily on Jews. So the far right either acts through a specific hatred of Jews, or they act through the lens of defending their own culture against replacement from foreign influence, as mentioned earlier with the Great Replacement theory.
Thank you, Josh. Next question is, sure it's something on all of our minds because we're hearing a lot of reports about this on a daily basis. How can we support Jewish college students on campus suffering from anti-Semitism in their lives there?
Mm-hmm. That is a very good question. I would say that the best way to support them and also to combat anti-Semitism in general is through education. And so to support Jewish college students, support Jewish organizations on campus that provide resources to those students, as well as education to non-Jewish students on campus. Making any activities that make Jews and Judaism accessible and visible and help bring it down to those who are not as familiar will help to dispel other myths and misperceptions about Judaism.
Can I do a quick follow-up? Are there details or specifics on those Jewish organizations at the Counter Extremism Project, or do you have references?
Hillel, Aish HaTorah, Chabad, many universities have Jewish studies programs, so I would say reach out to those organizations and departments, as well as history and language programs on campuses. They can also provide help in organizing educational activities.
Thank you.
Here's one from the audience. That's good. Since you're researching hard and traumatic events, what, if anything, brings you hope in your role?
Mm. So I don't trade in hope. No, I do have hope because I see a lot of people taking stands. I see a very nice turnout here tonight. I see people who are interested in learning and expanding their own perceptions, and not just within the Jewish community, but so it's that willingness to engage that gives me hope, and that I do have one slightly off topic, slightly related side note from that. Recently read a piece in the Atlantic about an Islamist preacher in Australia, Musa Sarantonio, who last year, who was previously considered one of the top propagandists for ISIS, but went to prison a few years ago, and last year he renounced ISIS completely after taking the time to read through the Quran and reached the conclusions they're not right. The ISIS is not right. So that there is an openness among some people, and that is what gives me hope, that willingness to learn.
Okay, next question is, how does social media affect anti-Semitism today? And I'll actually add my own addition to that, because it's something that I think about a lot, about social media. Do you think that social media outlets are doing enough to combat it?
So off the bat, no. So social media provides anti-Semites and other extremists a platform to spread their views, not only with sympathizers, but to those who do not automatically share their views. So they have a platform to recruit others into their ideologies. The Counter Extremism Project, since its founding in 2014, has been adamantly fighting to get social media companies to take more responsibility for the content on their sites. Many of these these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all have terms of service agreements that refuse to allow extremist content on their platforms. And the Counter Extremism Project has been calling on these platforms to enforce the terms of those agreements.
How and maybe when does anti-Israel sentiment cross into the anti-Semitism zone?
Sure. So anti-Israel is not necessarily always anti-Semitic. Just 2 weeks ago, I saw a pro-Palestinian anti-Israel rally marching through the streets of New York City with, of course, a large contingent from Neturei Karta, the Hasidic sect. But the anti-Zionism rather, crosses the line into anti-Semitism when it singles out Israel above all other nations and denies Israel the right to exist. If it holds Israel to a higher standard than any other nation and ignores any other nation's crimes, that is when it starts to cross the line.
Okay, next question is, what advice would you give on how to combat anti-Semitism on the left? It can be tough having these conversations since anti-Semitism on the left is not always as blatant.
Mm-hmm. So regarding combating anti-Semitism on the left, it is a matter of being vocal and being present with organizations that are barring Jewish symbols because they are too closely associated with Israel, or barring Jewish groups from rallies and demonstrations, it is important to speak out and make a very public stand that this sort of action is not acceptable. And that will, you can start the conversation privately with them, with these groups, but or individuals, but that eventually will have to turn into a public discussion, and that will help bring more pressure and open up the conversation to hopefully change some policies.
What this is a two-part question, so you can answer it however you want. But what are the most common manifestations of anti-Semitism, and what area is the fastest growing?
Oh, well. So I'm not sure I can answer which is the fastest growing, but I can say that the anti-Semitism on the far right tends to be more organized and more visible because of that. You see actual organizations such as National Socialist Movement or League of the South or Patriot Front that are specifically anti-Semitic. They, in their rhetoric, they either employ Nazi symbols and Nazi rhetoric, or they are specifically speaking out against Jews and making anti-Semitic claims. And by their very nature, they are much more organized and tend to have better platforms, websites, social media presence, demonstrations that are specifically anti-Semitic. And so they are more visible, and the specifically planned violence does tend to come more from the far right. The far left is not does not have as many specific anti-Semitic organizations as the far right does. It is more is not as overt as previously mentioned. You will see it couched in other ideas, and you have to dig a little deeper, but you can find it in other rallying cries that do tend to surround the issue of Israel.
Josh, in your presentation, you discussed briefly the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. How would you propose that the Jewish community can support this, this understanding of anti-Semitism, and how is that really the best, is that an effective way to rally the community together on this issue?
So there has actually been a competing definition that was released in recent years. I think it was last year or the year before. I don't recall offhand. But a group of academics decided that the IRA definition was too focused on Israel and limited criticism of Israel. So they created a separate definition. But the IRA definition has been adopted by dozens of countries around the world, including United States, several in Europe, Israel, as well as multiple organizations. And I think that remains the best definition available. And so I would say it is Jewish education groups and activists should look to that definition and promote it as part of their own educational efforts.
Can you elaborate on one of the points you just made? How does the IRA definition address criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism?
So let me just grab my notes on that one so I can have the exact definition in front of me and not misspeak on that.
I believe there is one line in there referencing, and correct me if I'm wrong, describing Israel as a quote unquote racist endeavor, which I suppose, would you agree, is one form of anti-Zionism?
I would say that yes, referring to Israel as a racist endeavor is a form of anti-Zionism and as well as anti-Semitism. So the IRA definition does call out the delegitimization of Israel. And so that is a good line to draw in the sand. When looking at rhetoric, are you singling out Israel above others? Are you calling for the state to be dismantled? Are you calling for reform within the state's practices? If you want the state to change its behavior, that's one thing. If you believe, if you say that Israel does not have a right to exist, then you are saying the Jewish people do not have that right to self-determination that all other people have, then that is where it crosses into anti-Semitism.
So here's one from the audience. How is the BDS movement anti-Semitic?
So the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, was started by several Palestinian activists, and it does call for the total economic, political, social, educational boycott of Israel. And it often ignores, it often does this while ignoring all other crimes. So the BDS movement does fall into the category of anti-Semitism by its very nature of the delegitimization of Israel, to such a point that the Palestinian Authority does not embrace the BDS movement officially. It has called for boycotts of the settlements in the West Bank, but not for, has not gone as far as the BDS movement in calling for the complete cultural boycott of Israel.
Thank you, Josh. Next question. This is a heavy issue. Can you discuss the trend of attacks on religious Jews, primarily in New York City, and the relationship between African Americans and Jews in this context?
So in recent years, there has been a noted uptick in attacks on visibly Jewish individuals within New York. Every week, I see more reports coming from the police of various attacks, people being harassed on the streets, physical attacks, people having their yarmulkes, hats knocked off, things of that nature. So these attacks are, over the past couple of years, there has been more of an openness among extremists on the far right to voice their ideas, as well as, and this has extended to anti-Semites as well. So we see a lot more than we used to. On the other hand, it could also be partly due to better reporting, which is a positive, but we still need to seriously address these weekly, if not daily, occurrences. Regarding the relationship of the African-American community and Jewish community, it has been a long and bumpy relationship. In the 60s, Jews were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. And since then, there have been many more disturbances between the Black and Jewish communities. So some popular Black authors have written about the relationship being one of tenant and landlord, and that Jews represented the landlord, and while the Black community represented the mistreated tenants in their buildings. And so that relationship, this analogy emerged in the 70s, I believe it was. And we also see groups like the Black Israelites that who were responsible for the attack in some of whose members were responsible for the attack in Jersey City. And like some other groups, they subscribe to a theory of replacement, that they are the true children of Israel, and that the current Jews are pretenders, so that they justify harassment and violent attacks by staking their claim to the what they consider the legitimate legacy of the people of Israel. And I see okay. There's a comment about Farrakhan also.
Yeah.
So Farrakhan and his Nation of Islam have dealt with that Jewish theme of Jewish rejectionism, that very specifically, Farrakhan has promoted the idea that God wholeheartedly rejected the Jews, and that because of that, it is essentially open season. And I'm just going to take 1 second to drop some information in the chat. I forgot to do this earlier. Just wanted to put out, this is my contact information and links to our reports for anyone who would like to follow up on those reports or follow up with me afterward.
So there's a big question that's probably been asked by 3 people, and there are others probably too who are thinking this, and that is, how do we counter anti-Semitism? How do we combat it? Like, what can we do today as a community, whether it's on campus, whether it's in daily life? Any suggestions?
The main things that we can do to combat this are education and speaking out. We must take a vocal stand. During my, when I was in high school, living in State College, Pennsylvania, my mother was on the oversight board of Penn State Hillel, and at the time, a known anti-Semite in the area, had taken out a Holocaust revisionist ad in the student newspaper on campus. My mother and other Hillel board members and student members joined together on campus to protest this. And it was events like this that helped form my own dedication to recognizing and pursuing absolute truth and making those statements and fighting back against uh, uh, ignorance and misinformation. It is education and the willingness to stand up are the best tools that we have. It is best not to resort to physical altercations unless in absolute self-defense, but make your arguments logically through well thought out points, and just present those arguments, and you will find that the anti-Semites just cannot stand up to that.
So I have one more question, and then I think we're going to have to call it. But in terms of education, do you, in your current position, go to schools and present about this type of topic, or have you also ever used like your grandparents' story and gone into classrooms to use that in terms of education?
So my mother, through the 90s and early 2000s, would go to schools to speak about her parents' experiences and her own growing up as a child of survivors who learned to walk in front of the barracks at Bergen-Belsen. So I actually have hundreds of thank you letters sent to her from middle school students across Pennsylvania for her years of speaking. In my position, I have spoken with synagogues, Rotary clubs, and other organizations, as well as some student groups. So I look to the example set by my mother to continue that and really be a beacon of information as best as possible.
Josh, we thank you so much for taking us through your presentation and for sharing, especially about your grandparents. That's very meaningful to us. And I'm sure that we've all learned something tonight. Thanks again to all of you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for having me. I did want to just quickly address one thing I just saw in the chat about Islamist anti-Semitism. So I didn't cover that so much in the presentation. However, if you click on the links to the reports, it is thoroughly covered in those sections, as well as in multiple reports on the Counter Extremism Project's website.
Great. Before we sign off, I just had a few closing remarks, but thank you again. And thank you to all of us, all of you for joining us tonight. This event and the contents therein really shows us all too well why education is more important and more urgent than ever. We see the horrifying rise of anti-Semitism through headlines on a daily basis, and we know that we need to put the effort in to make a difference. Now, we speak often about the importance of educating youth. And as I mentioned in the chat, I'm currently an educator with an organization called Club Z, Zionism for Teens. Someone had asked about it. Just a quick remark. It's an organization that educates Jewish teens about their heritage and the history of Israel and how to navigate these conversations that teens are having today about Israel, Zionism, and anti-Semitism. And most importantly, promotes pride in our identity and teaches Jewish teens to stand up for themselves. Now, in regards to Holocaust education, studies have shown that students who receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and more comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They're more willing to challenge incorrect and biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. So I'd like to share with you all how 3GNY is trying to make a difference to educate the next generation and to help prevent anti-Semitism and bigotry. 3GNY, we are proud to say, has trained more than 350 speakers in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and around the country through its flagship We Do program, which stands for We Educate. We have spoken in more than 500 classrooms, and we have impacted more than 31,000 students and community members. Again, 31,000 students and community members. Between our live programming and our YouTube channel, more than 18,000 additional people have heard our stories. Through our grandparents' testimonies, we talk about the importance of stepping in early and often, where small injustices are found anywhere, on the playground, in the classroom, and on the street, because it's the easiest and most efficient way to act. By the time Nazi tanks roll in, it's too late. So if you want to learn more, don't hesitate to reach out. There's an email address in the chat, and you will all receive a follow-up email tomorrow. And I do have one more announcement. We're very excited to advertise for our first in-person event in over 2 years, which will be a happy hour gathering on Wednesday, May 25 at Hidden Lane Bar in Manhattan. We're looking forward to seeing each other in person, and many of us who have met virtually over the past 2 years haven't yet met in real life. So this is going to be a great event. We hope to see many of you there as we convene our wonderful community of over 16 years. There are also going to be many other virtual events upcoming, including discussion groups and more, of course. We'll send out an email tomorrow with info on these events, as well as a recording of tonight's program. Thank you again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. We are grateful, as always, for your presence and your support. Good night.